we could have a ceasefire tomorrow, or we could have a road to war in Europe again. And let's hope it's the former. That's what everybody wants.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've had Hamish de Bretton-Gordon on the show. He's, of course, a former British Army colonel. We speak about this meeting tomorrow. It is crunch time. Putin and Trump meeting for the first time since 2019 in Alaska. So we speak all about the predictions of what we think might happen, the best and the worst case scenarios. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, former British Army colonel, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thanks very much for having me.
We've got one more day until the big event, of course, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin's meeting. But we're going to start off with kind of a look at what is happening in Ukraine. Now, the Russian army have made some gains in the last few weeks. A little bit less significant than the Kremlin's propaganda machine would suggest, but Ukraine has confirmed that there's over 100,000 Russian troops situated in Pavlovsk and the Dobropilya region in Donetsk. They've also made large advancements across Donbass and then that includes also Luhansk. So they're kind of occupying a lot of that area, pretty much the whole of Luhansk is what we know. But Hamish, these advancements, does it indicate to you that the Russian army and Vladimir Putin are quickly trying to make so many advancements that they have the upper hand in this meeting tomorrow between Putin and Trump?
Well, I think the first thing that people should take from this, what it shows, is that actually, President Putin has really no interest in peace at the moment. He still thinks he's winning, and this is a demonstration. They put a heck of a lot of effort into it. This is a great summer offensive that the Russians have been planning, for the last 6 months, and it's only been the last couple of weeks actually that they've made any gains. And these gains are pretty small, pretty insignificant. They've had maybe 50, 100 Russian soldiers who've managed to get through Ukrainian lines and get up to sort of 5 or 6 kilometers behind the lines. But actually, if what Ukrainian military are posting today, a lot of those Russians have been killed or captured, and the lines haven't moved a heck of a lot. But it's true that, as you say, the Russians have got a lot of troops in this particular area. And I think it was to be a show of strength. And we know that the Russians put a heck of a lot of effort into getting the Ukrainians out of Kursk, and that took them a long time. And there are still a little areas of Kursk that Ukraine still hold. But generally, apart from on the front line, the war is very, very active. The Russians are still firing up to 500 drones and missiles a night at Ukrainian cities. But conversely, or not conversely, but the Ukrainians are making real progress as well in what we call the deep battle, deep strikes into Russia with drones and missiles. And it would appear that actually the Ukrainians have managed to destroy about 17% of the Russian oil refining industry. And that is critical because that's where they're getting all their money from. The Ukrainians have also, on the cyber area, have attacked Aeroflot, they've attacked pharmacies and others, which is having a real impact on the rank and file in Russia. So although Russia is trying to turn everybody's view to what's happening in the Donbass and that area, actually it's not very much. And I think I agree, it was a build up to the great summit, but we only knew about the summit fairly recently, and this thing has been planned for months and months and months. So yeah, I don't think the Russians are making a great deal of progress, but on the same count, they're not looking as though they're about to give up and go into sort of ceasefire mode, as it were.
But he will try and convince Trump tomorrow that he is winning this war, Hamish, that he will try and convince Trump of that. He will also try and concede less. He will try and take more of Ukraine. Do you think this will be the tactic that Putin uses on Donald Trump, that he's the one in charge, he's the one winning this war?
Oh, very, absolutely, very much so. And I think those of us who've been looking and following Putin over the last years he no doubt will want to replicate the meeting he had with Trump in 2018, where he absolutely rang rings around the American president in his first term. And there are very great concerns. Fiona Hill, who was Trump's advisor at that meeting, who incidentally is a Brit and now spends a lot of the time here, she writes very clearly in the papers today that at that time Putin ran rings around Trump, and Putin speaks English pretty well, I believe. Trump doesn't speak a word of Russian, and the concern is that in the initial one-on-one type meeting, that actually it will be conducted in English, but the nuances that Putin will get out of it, that is the real concern. And absolutely, Putin wants to convince Trump that he's winning, and the only way out of this is to get great concessions out of the Ukrainians. And I think that the final bit to this is really important. The former head of MI6, Alex Younger, today on BBC Radio 4 saying, look, Putin has no desire to stop here. His maximalist aims rather, of the complete subjugation of Ukraine have not changed at all. And it was interesting in the meeting yesterday between President Trump, Zelensky and the European leaders that Zelensky reminded Trump that Putin is bluffing. And when you put that together and what Alex Younger, the head of MI6, has said, then there is cause concern that Putin appears to have the upper hand. But I was speaking to people in the security world in the UK, and they sort of agree with this, but they also say that the Russians are nervous going into the summit because they're not quite sure how Trump is going to act. And we've seen that, he is an unreliable negotiator, which I suppose if you're playing poker is probably not a bad place to be. And if the Russians are slightly nervous, then maybe there is cause for hope.
Are you worried that Trump will fall for this propaganda that he's winning the war, that he's making such strides on the battlefield, Hamish, even though Russia, yes, this summer of offensive, it hasn't lived up to exactly what they marketed it as, but they're still making these gains. But the reality is like economically, Russia can't afford to be going at this pace. So do you think that he will convince Trump of the fact that this is the steady pace that they will continue going at?
Well, I'm sure that Putin and his KGB, his Kremlin spies will have done their homework and done an awful lot of detail into exactly Trump, what fires his rockets and what doesn't. And I'm sure they will really approach this in a very comprehensive way, which, unfortunately, we don't have the same confidence with Trump. I mean, his key advisor, Steve Witkoff, who went to Moscow a week before last to start off this process, was completely run rings around by the Russians and actually brought the wrong message back. Again, he used a Russian interpreter in his conversations with Putin. Now, those of us who've been involved in the security and intelligence world, you would never do that. But Witkoff is a real estate dealer, and we'll talk about some of his ideas on creating a sort of Israeli West Bank type scenario in Ukraine, and that is a concern. But when you go back to the main question here, there is a concern that rings might be run around Trump. However, what is really firing Trump's rockets at the moment is the fact that the amount of casualties that the Russians are inflicting on Ukrainian civilians. And Trump has told Putin to stop this on a number of occasions. And, his ego is the most, the biggest thing driving Trump. And he probably feels his ego has been pretty hammered at the moment. So, there is so much to play for here. But when it comes to the arch sort of geopolitical strategist, Putin has been, the top dog for a number of years in that position.
Well, Hamish, I wonder if the best case scenario for the West is that Putin does offend Trump's ego and almost get him going, get him motivated to hit Putin where it hurts.
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is, but I slightly go back to my point that the Russians will have done their homework really, really well, and of course they will be concerned that they don't rile Trump too much. This is what I was saying about the Russians are nervous. They press the wrong button and suddenly Trump unloads on them. They know that Trump is worried that the amount of ammunition and weaponry that the Americans are having or were having to give the Ukrainians, the effect it's having on their economy. Us in Europe, we're slightly happy at the moment that Trump is focused on Europe because he doesn't really want to focus too much on his own internal problems. So focusing on Europe and Ukraine is a good way. And he's sort of slightly taken his foot off the gas in the Middle East, Iran and Israel. But he could very quickly go back to that. So yeah, it's finely balanced. I think we have to look at the best case and worst case type scenarios. The best case scenario is that the Russians agree to a ceasefire that is acceptable to the Ukrainians. In other words, pretty much freezing the borders where they are and then negotiating, freezing the front lines, then negotiating from there. The worst case scenario for us here in Europe is that Trump can't get a ceasefire and walks away. And that is where the European countries have absolutely got to step in and do stuff. And if necessary, up their support to the Ukrainians. Because one starts with the premise that Putin thinks he's winning the war and doesn't want to stop. He's told his people what his aims are. And if he fails in his aims, that's the end of him, and he knows it. So we're in a really difficult position here. So we've got a best case, which is a ceasefire, and a worst case, the war carries on and potentially involves Europe as well.
Well, we'll get into Europe's involvement, Hamish, if that worst case scenario does come to light. But it is crunch time tomorrow, August 15th. The Friday will mark the first time these two have met since 2019. Now, other than a ceasefire, what is the priority for tomorrow from Trump, do you think?
Well, absolutely. Number one is the ceasefire, and that's what the European leaders and President Zelensky were telling him yesterday. That's what everybody wants. They want the guns to stop. Now, it appears that Putin, and certainly the briefings coming out of the White House, he also wants to talk about other stuff to Putin, like the Arctic. And mainly it's about deals. It's about minerals, rare earth minerals, and actually doing business. So one hopes that would be very secondary, and one hopes that Trump won't even go on to that unless he actually does get a ceasefire. But you never quite know with him. And of course, he did bully Zelensky into a deal on Ukrainian rare earth minerals, which eventually sort of unlocked US support again. So again, I say the Russians are nervous. We're all pretty nervous as well. But the ceasefire is the number one thing that hopefully is focusing on. And that's what the briefings out of the White House are saying, that is his number one aim.
So Donald Trump earlier in the week, he called this meeting with him and Putin a listening exercise and really a feel-out meeting. But then yesterday in his virtual meeting with the European leaders and President Zelensky, he said that there would be very severe consequences if Putin doesn't agree to end the war. So, Hamish, what do you think is the truth here? Do you think that Trump will stand firm against Putin and say, if we don't enter a ceasefire, if I don't see at least confirmation that you're willing to end the war, he will slap these consequences, which we would assume would be these secondary sanctions?
Well, they're sort of mixed messages, but we are getting very used to President Trump not necessarily changing his mind, but changing his narrative on a fairly regular basis. So, as you said, at the beginning of the week, he was there to listen to what Putin had to say. And he'd probably say that he's been there to listen to what the European leaders and Zelensky has had to say. But then again, he rather contradicts that and trying to put the pressure, back on the Russians. So I think that's why these things are so finely balanced. We just do not know. I don't think we've ever had a US president who has been so want to change his view and change his position. And he seems to be the sort of person, he doesn't follow briefs. He reacts to situations, to what he thinks might be the best way of doing things, which doing a real estate deal, that is probably fine and okay when you're only dealing with bricks and mortar and money. But when you're dealing with lives and countries, to go off brief, as it were, is incredibly dangerous. It won't be losing a few dollars if he gets this wrong. It's potentially thousands of lives at risk and potentially war again in Europe. So let's hope that he does stick to his guns, and let's hope that by putting pressure back on the Russians, that they will get these massive sanctions and tariffs, which we know will strangle their military economy. That he follows through with that. But we've all still got in the back of our minds that last meeting with Putin, where in fact Fiona Hill, writing in the Telegraph today, said she almost thought of having a seizure to stop the meeting. And that she is a very serious diplomat, and to say stuff like that really underlines how serious things are. So we're hoping that Trump follows his brief. Putin's got all his top dogs with him. He's got Lavrov, he's got his defense secretary. No doubt he'll have his Secret Service boss as well. One assumes that Trump will have his top dogs as well with him. But, they are, J.D. Vance, Hesketh, and Witkoff, who are not career diplomats. Most of them are business. Hesketh, the defense secretary, of course, was in the military, but for very, very short time. So it's almost amateurs against professionals. The Trump lot might be professional businessmen, but we are yet to give them that epitaph when it comes to strategic decision making, particularly when war and fighting is at stake.
Hamish, you mentioned this meeting between Trump and Zelensky back in February, which, yes, of course, honestly sent everyone into a spin, this switching gears, and it was horrible to watch. But in this phone conversation yesterday with Trump, Zelensky and European allies, do you think he convinced them enough that he has both Ukraine and Europe's best interests at heart, and that he will not flip gears if Putin charms him?
Well, I think we must really take what those leaders said. And President Zelensky was at number 10 Downing Street in the UK this morning, or meeting with Starmer, although there was no readout from that meeting. Certainly yesterday, Zelensky said he was happy and he thought that Trump was on the right track. So did Keir Starmer, the British leader, and Friedrich Merz, the German leader, who's been now sort of really leaning forward in this. Now, if these guys who've met Trump and have discussed this with him, and I no doubt have briefed him in great detail, are happy that he's on the right track, then I think us observers must take that for being what the case absolutely is. But one knows with any high stakes meeting like this, things can go wrong, and because particularly in Trump's case, he does seem to change his mind. He does seem to make some incredibly strange decisions, and Putin seems to have some beguiling hold over Trump. Again, speaking to experts in the security world, they say that Trump is sort of fascinated by the oligarchy that surrounds the whole Putin era and lifestyle. Almost in I dare say, hero worship type way. So we are, that's why we're not certain. It should be if Trump sticks to the guns that he's offered to the European leaders and Zelensky yesterday, things should be fine. But this is sadly a two-way thing between him and Putin. Now, had Zelensky been there, and maybe had some of the European leaders been there, it might change things slightly differently. But we have just got to hope, and I keep saying the word hope when a ceasefire or potential war in Europe is on the cards is a pretty lame term to use. But yeah, we have got to hope that what Trump has sold to the European leaders and Zelensky yesterday, he can also sell to Putin tomorrow in Alaska.
Well, one of the other things that came out of that meeting, and you mentioned the fact that Zelensky won't be at this meeting tomorrow, Hamish, is of course the meeting tomorrow is a one-on-one with Trump and Putin. But the US president, he did confirm that there is a possibility that Zelensky and Putin could have their own meeting that could take place almost immediately after he meets with the Russian president, if it goes well. So what do you think the likelihood is that happens, where Trump and Putin have a good enough meeting, it all goes well to the point where Zelensky, waiting in the wings, is brought in to have his own meeting with President Zelensky, President Trump, Putin, sorry. Trump said he may or may not be there. It's up to them.
Well, we're talking about the best case scenario here. So yeah, it might well be an option. Maybe we should be looking at Flight Tracker to see where Zelensky's jet is, and if it's heading US ways, yeah, maybe they would meet in Alaska. I mean, where Putin and Zelensky would meet would be that is quite a tall order. Putin would only meet Trump, I expect, either in Russia or Alaska, because it's only a stone's throw from Russia. So a meeting with Zelensky, if it's going to be very quickly, presumably it's going to be in Alaska. I can't imagine that Zelensky would go to Russia to meet Putin, but because he probably doesn't think he'd ever come back from that. But again, it's very easy to be super cynical in these things, and it's very easy because we've been following this war in Ukraine so closely and seen what's happened and the war crimes and everything else. And we keep going back to it. This isn't a real estate deal. This is a deal between peace and war. So yeah, if things go really well, I'm sure Zelensky, would be around for a meeting with Putin. But that is absolutely the best case, which we're all praying for. But it does seem a little bit unlikely at the moment. And I suppose the final thing I'd say on this is, no doubt an awful lot of administration and logistics is going on just in case that does happen. So it might seem odd to people who are not involved in these sort of things, saying, well, how could Zelensky get from Europe to Alaska for a meeting, on Monday or Tuesday? Yeah, it will be preordained and organised, I am sure, as will a number of other scenarios as well, I expect.
Now, tomorrow, Hamish, will be a lot about land. This has become such a talking point about whether Ukraine would give up land and the fact that Russia wants land. Now, as it stands, Russia has occupied about 19% of Ukrainian land, which does include Crimea, which of course they annexed in 2014. The Times is reporting that the US and Russia will propose a West Bank-style occupation of Ukraine in the meeting. This idea is reportedly supported by Steve Witkoff. As you mentioned, he discussed this with the Kremlin in his meeting the other week when he travelled to Moscow. If it's an imitation of what happened in the West Bank, it would basically see Russia have military and economic control of that 19% of Ukraine that they currently occupy. The White House denied that this happened, denied that this is going to be a talking point tomorrow, denied that Steve Witkoff is backing this. They called it fake news. But in terms of Trump just agreeing to give up land to Russia, is this worrying? Do you think that this might be a case where he thinks this is the only way he's going to get a deal done and he has to give up some sort of land to Russia? Now, just for context for our listeners and viewers, this does need to go through the Ukrainian constitution because he can't just give up land, but this would be something that he might give into.
Well, I think, there are lots of issues here, as you say, and as was mentioned by Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, yesterday, when he was giving a briefing on the meeting, he said that the European leaders had agreed there was no legal way that Russia could take control of the land that they had illegally invaded and wanted to take over. So you're right, that even if the Ukrainians agreed to it, there would have to be it would have to go through their parliament. which would no doubt take some time. I think it's really unfortunate that Witkoff and this piece has been presented as a West Bank type Israeli Gaza solution, because, crikey, that I don't think anybody in the world thinks that is, a really good way to sort problems out. And the problems that obviously we're seeing in Israel is personifying that position. And rather lazy description, I expect, by Witkoff and some others to equate it to that. But the possibility of some negotiation over the land, is no doubt a sort of reality. But by trying to set it up as a sort of West Bank option, just I think shoots it out of the sky immediately because of the connotations of what that well might mean. But I think Zelensky has in the past said that there might have to be some sort of trade-off in this area, certainly in the short term, and because everybody is so desperate for peace, it might well have to be something that Ukrainians have to suffer because of it, because they know if not, and the war goes on, everything could be lost. But I don't think the Russian position is we want all four of those oblasts, which would equate to well over 19% of the territory, as well as Crimea as well. So it's that there is probably something to be done on the land, but I think the way that it's been fronted and put up, and especially with Steve Witkoff's sort of DNA all over it, people immediately sort of discard it as being a bit fanciful. But if there is to be, if we are going to get that ceasefire, I don't think the Russians are going to be forced out of the areas they've illegally taken, certainly straight away, and there might have to be some sort of buffer zone. And of course, there will also need to be a force to enforce the ceasefire, which is where the Europeans come in. And we know they've done a heck of a lot of work on this because it's going to be a very powerful military force. And the best case option is that it's there as a ceasefire protection force. The worst case option, of course, is that it might well be there to support Ukraine if Russia continues with its attacks.
Now, as I've mentioned, Zelensky, he's vehemently denied that he would ever give up any land to Russia. But as I mentioned, I worry that Donald Trump will find this as the only way he can get a deal done. Now, if that's the case and Zelensky's put in a tough position where he thinks he might have to give up at least Donbass to Russia, I wonder if he would do this but ask for the commitment to security and protection from the United States, Europe, or even both. Because, Hamish, when you're looking at this from a military perspective and you're looking at this from someone who covers Vladimir Putin's movements and desires so much, what do you think the likelihood is that in a few years to come, and they've, economically recovered in Russia, they've militarily recovered both with weaponry and with troops, would they invade again?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's any shadow of a doubt there. And that was part of the conversation yesterday about security guarantees. And Trump did give security guarantees to Ukraine. So if the scenario you paint comes to fruition, which is a real possibility, then the US providing security guarantees and probably Europe with hard military power on the ground will have to be there and have to be there for some time. Because I don't think anybody who looks at this in any detail thinks that Russia or Putin will stop. He might well hold for a few years to build up his military force, but he's always said his aim is the complete subjugation of Ukraine. In fact, he's stated many times over, probably over the last 10 years, that he wants to redraw the Soviet Union, the USSR boundaries. And Ukraine is just a part of that. So absolutely, if there is a peace deal which involves Russia taking some of Ukraine's land, there must be a sort of hard military line provided by US security guarantees and probably European military hard power to ensure that the Russians can't again advance westwards.
Would that be the only way you could ever see Zelensky agreeing to any sort of land, giving up any sort of land?
Yeah, I can absolutely. I think otherwise, I'm sure his view and the Ukrainian people's view is, a bad deal or no deal is better than a bad deal. And that's what we're talking about, a bad deal for Ukraine. So if they are going to have to trade some land, they want absolutely cast iron guarantees that that's going to be it, certainly for the next generation.
Hamish, just a final question for you. If this meeting is unsuccessful, Donald Trump almost seems as if he'll walk away from any sort of future negotiations if it looks like we cannot get a resolution in any way. Is the way that Europe steps up by confiscating this 190 billion euros worth of frozen Russian assets and immediately give it to Ukraine to help fund their fight for years to come, while also pressuring Donald Trump and the US to keep up sanctions?
Yeah, I think the worst case scenario I think that we're talking about there is absolutely that. But I mean, I think it's far more than giving them the frozen Russian assets. I think Europe is going to have to step up militarily, and at least that is something that Trump has enabled, because Europe is spending money on armaments, probably at the same level the Russians are, and the combined strength of the European armies, now strengthened with Finland and Sweden, vastly overmatches anything that the Russians have. But Europe is going to have to be prepared to flex those muscles. So the worst case scenario is really Europe taking up and supporting Ukraine to prevent Russia going further. And I think everybody is hoping and praying that we don't come to that. But we could have a ceasefire tomorrow, or we could have a road to war in Europe again. And let's hope it's the former. That's what everybody wants.
Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you for having me.